This is a recording for Social Studies Chapter 11, From Territory to Province. What changes happened as the Northwest Territories became the province of Alberta? As I ride around Alberta with Mom, I always notice the names of the communities and the places in them. I'm especially interested in the names of schools. Some schools have names of geographical places. Banded Peak School in Bragg Creek is named after a nearby mountain. Fish Creek School in Calgary is located near Fish Creek Provincial Park. Some schools are named after people and are really familiar, such as Guy Wiedik. He and four ranchers and businessmen started the Calgary Stampede. Other schools are named after people I've never heard of, like Marguerite Bourgeois. I wonder why the names were chosen. I'm finding out that there are whole stories about our history just in the names of some of our schools. How did settlement affect different groups of people? Captain John Palliser's school in Calgary is named after a man who came from Britain. He was asked to explore the prairies and find out if the area was suitable for settlement. Mike Mountain Horse School in Lethbridge is named after Mike Mountain Horse. He worked for the RCMP and the Canadian Pacific Railway. How did the coming of the railway change the West? Why did various people make the choice to come to what is now Alberta? How do names tell stories of Alberta's history? This is a good question. We can kind of think about in the previous chapter, we read about Anthony Henday. And as we know, it's a highway in Edmonton is named after him. So names do tell stories. In what ways did immigrants and other settlers contribute to Alberta? Settlement and change. How did settlement affect different groups of people? North America once had many millions of buffalo that helped Aboriginal people meet their basic needs. Between 1830 and 1870, the Hudson's Bay Company and American fur traders wanted the buffalo hides for trading. Hundreds of thousands of buffalo were killed each year. Wagon load after wagon load of hides were moved to the south to the United States and to eastern Canada. The Canadian government was encouraging settlers to move west. They wanted to develop the Northwest Territories and expand Canada. The movement of people into the area meant continued changes to Aboriginal ways of life. Years later, the bones that had been bleached under the hot prairie sun were harvested and shipped east. They were ground up or burned so they could be used for fertilizer. Some people foretold future problems, but it was hard to believe. The mighty herds might disappear. The winter count tells the story. This Buchanan winter count represents 1875, a time when there were many buffalo. About 75,000 hides were shipped to eastern Canada and the United States. This Buchanan winter count represents the year, likely 1879, when the buffalo disappeared. This was the last year of the Great Blackfoot Buffalo hunts. How do you think the disappearance of the buffalo affected Aboriginal people? Signing treaties. During the 1870s, there were about 35,000 First Nations people living in the western areas that had been opened up to settlement. The Canadian government wanted to be sure settlement could continue. They made offers to First Nations people. They asked them to sign formal agreements called treaties. These treaties outlined how the land and the rights of First Nations people would be handled. The details of each treaty were different. Overall, in exchange for vast amounts of land, First Nations were promised a number of things. Some of these include farming equipment, seeds, farm animals, and farming instruction. As well, 1 square mile, about 2.5 square kilometers per family of 5, would be set aside or reserved for them. First Nations people would also have hunting and fishing rights. There would be a first payment and then yearly payments to the people. This is a map that shows the different treaties. In Edmonton, we are part of Treaty 6 territory. So we acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 land. Treaty 7. Treaty 7 was signed by two groups of people. One group was the First Nations. This included the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, Tsuut'ina, and Nakota people. The other group, called the Crown, included representatives of the Canadian government. At the time the treaties were signed, First Nations people were experiencing these situations. Disease and the loss of buffalo made the future seem hard, and starvation was possible. Missionaries were urging them to sign the treaties. Non-Aboriginal people were already starting to settle on Blackfoot lands. In addition, First Nations and the Crown had different understandings and points of view about the meaning and intention of the treaties. Before this time, First Nations groups had certain territories they would use to meet their needs. First Nations such as the Blackfoot and Cree had treaties for peacemaking. These were agreements not to move into each other's territory. They did not write this down, but they knew about it. To the Crown, a treaty was a legal document that removed First Nations rights to certain areas of land. The land would be used for new settlers. First Nations people believed they were agreeing to the sharing of land, not the ownership of land. They respected these agreements. So oral agreements were made between the First Nations people and the Europeans. So First Nations people agreed to share their land. Métis struggles. Some Métis people were included in the early treaties. As a group, however, they were not included in the signing of treaties. Instead, the government gave Métis people certificates called scrip. The scrip certificates were granted to each Métis person. If a Métis person agreed to give up their claims to Aboriginal land, their scrip could be exchanged for about 65 to 97 hectares of land. Scrip was often sold to buy things that were needed, such as food and clothing. Many Métis people felt they had little choice in accepting the scrip. We sometimes drive past Louis Riel Elementary and Junior High School. Mom said Louis Riel was a Métis leader in the 1800s. He worked to make Manitoba a province. He was the grandson of Marie-Anne Gabory Lagamodorier, who once lived at Fort Edmonton. Much of his history took place in what is now Saskatchewan and Manitoba. But it was also very important to Alberta. These places were all once part of the Northwest Territories. Northwest resistance. In the 1880s, Métis people in the area of present-day Saskatchewan were worried. They needed land to live on. In 1884, Louis Riel and Gabrielle Dumont were leaders for the Métis. They told the government about Métis concerns, but they got little response. A year later, the Métis and some First Nations formed their own government. This led to violent conflicts between the Métis and the settlers and RCMP. The actions of the Métis opposing the government of Canada is called the Northwest Resistance. Government troops were sent to stop the conflict. Riel and the two First Nations leaders, Big Bear and Poundmaker, eventually surrendered. Dumont escaped to the United States. At his trial, Riel was found guilty of acting against the government of Canada. He was later hanged. Several Cree and Nakota fighters were also hanged for their part in the killings during the resistance. The Métis had lost their leaders. Many felt the government was still not responding well enough to their concerns. Métis people had to struggle to keep their way of life in the years that followed. Louis Riel was one of the key leaders of the resistance. This is Louis Riel. Saint Paul des Métis. The Oblate Fathers were concerned about the Métis people. They wanted to start a Roman Catholic reserve for them. In 1896, Father Albert Lacombe obtained land near Saddle Lake from the Canadian government. Father Te Rien was put in charge. He started a new settlement named St. Paul de Métis. Notices printed in French, English, and Cree encouraged Métis and First Nations people to come to settle and farm there. The settlers were promised land to lease, farming equipment to use, seeds to plant, and schools for their children. The settlement had many problems. Promises were broken. Supplies did not arrive. The settlement was far from the railway, so it was costly to ship goods and supplies. The settlement did not receive the funding it needed from the government. Many people chose to leave the settlement. Father Adio Dat Theron became convinced the settlement land should be offered to the Francophone homesteaders from Quebec, who arrived in 1908. Later, Ukrainian people began to settle there. It officially became the town of St. Paul in 1937. Early settlers from Quebec. Germain Joly is the grandson of two Francophone homesteaders who moved to St. Paul de Métis. Father Theron was the brother of Monsieur Joly's grandmother. Interviewer: why did your family come from Quebec to Alberta? Father Theron sent letters to his family and friends in Quebec. He encouraged them to move west to make a new life. Priests wrote letters and put advertisements in newspapers. They traveled to Quebec, the Maritimes, and even France, recruiting French Catholic settlers for Alberta. My grandparents brought 14 of their children with them, along with several aunts and uncles and cousins. Where did they settle? For several years, the family worked at the St. Paul de Métis mission. They farmed and worked in the lumber mill. They could work there, but could not own the land. The land had been set aside as special Métis settlement. In 1909, the situation changed when the original settlement was ended. My father and 9 of his brothers lined up at the land registry office in Edmonton. They paid $10 to purchase their own quarter section of land. To keep the land, they were required to clear the land and put up a building. What was life like for you as a child? We grew up in a strong Francophone community. My parents learned to speak only a few words of English. French was used throughout the community. I didn't know any English when I started school. By law, we had to learn English in school, but the rest of the time, my world was Francophone. I remember our parents discussed Francophone concerns. They wanted French schools for their children. What happened to your family? There are now many members of the Joly family in Alberta, across Canada and in the United States. At our first family reunion in 1984, 600 people showed up. Now each family has their own reunion because the Joly family members are in the thousands. People in Alberta lined up at registry offices to obtain land. This is present-day St. Paul. What contributed to the ending of the St. Paul de Métis settlements? Building the railway. How did the coming of the railway change the West? The railway across Canada was important to the growth of Alberta. People's supplies in the RCMP could more easily travel from eastern Canada. This made settlement in the West more appealing. It encouraged many people to move there. Immigrants were drawn to Alberta to work and live. This is a timeline of the railway.